Hey, what's up guys? I'm here with another Q&A on Ruth chapter 4, which was also our message on Sunday, which as you know was this beautiful story in the end of God's restoration of Ruth and Naomi and this redeeming figure called Boaz, right? He orchestrates this public legal showdown. The closer family redeemer doesn't end up claiming Ruth and Naomi's inheritance, and therefore Boaz takes Ruth as his wife, bears a child to Naomi's family. The line gets extended. There's a genealogy at the end with Boaz's name on it that leads to King David and ultimately to Jesus for us who read it as Christians. And I've got some questions here, so let's just dive in. Okay, the first one is a very lengthy question, but the heart of it is really about tactics, right? Boaz's approach, right? Was it questionable? Could he have done it differently? And so on. How do you think the outcome might be had Boaz approached it differently, right? If he didn't employ this legal public showmanship of a tactic, instead, for example, tells the closer redeemer that he needs to redeem Ruth first and so on and so forth. In other words, this is calling into question here Boaz's approach, right? Was it a bit manipulative? Was it noble and courageous? What's to go there? Well, there are a couple of ways of answering that question, I think. First of all, we should understand Boaz's motivation just from the way the story flows, okay? And before you get to chapter 4, you got to get to chapter 3. And that night on the threshing room floor, we are revealed something about Boaz's heart for Ruth, right? You can see that in verses 10 and following of chapter 3. Boaz blesses Ruth for her courageous act of uncovering his feet and propositioning herself in the dark on the threshing room floor. And there we're revealed that there is a closer family redeemer. However, Boaz's concern there is to let the thing play out, okay? So that's what he says there in verses 12 and 13. And in verse 13, he says, look, if this man wants to redeem you, that's good, okay? In other words, that's an option. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Okay, so that is already the signal for us that Boaz would have an agenda here. And his agenda is to take on and claim this non-Jew, this Moabite woman, possibly because he himself was the son of Rahab. He was a halfie himself. He knows what it's like to be a half foreigner in the land. Ruth is now in his hands, as it were, to let this thing all play out. That's one way of answering the question in terms of Boaz's agenda here. Now, that brings us to chapter 4 and this whole courtyard scene, this gathering of the men at the city gates, and whether there was tactic used there or not. I think it's pretty clear just from the setting of chapter 4 that we have a man who is orchestrating things down to the very T. The way that I know this is that the gate of the town in those days was the place where legal and business transactions were met. It was a public forum. It was a place where there'd be witnesses. And in fact, the very structure of the gate entryway itself actually invited people to sit and to talk things out publicly. It was kind of like this language of going to the gate of the town was almost a euphemism for going to court in our modern day equivalent terms. That is, going to the hearing or going to have the legal proceedings be laid out in public. That's actually the setting. That's an important thing to notice. But secondly, look at the way that Boaz gets everyone on board, comes here to sit down, right? He takes 10 men. Why 10 men? Well, 10 men would be enough witnesses, but 10 men was also the number that you would require for a synagogue to have. And he tells them to sit there, and then as notice before that, as he waits for this family redeemer to come, this closer man, we're not told his name. However, there's enough in here for us to know that this man was already going to be questionable from Boaz's point of view. Boaz, up till now has been extraordinarily friendly and kind, and yet even the way that he talks to this closer family redeemer, you'd almost feel like there's something cold and icy about it. Look, the guy comes in verse 1 and he says, and Boaz says to him, come over here, sit down. Right, doesn't even address his name, doesn't even bless him like the way that he did with his own workers. It's almost like that this closer family redeemer was himself a shady guy, a questionable sort of guy. There's enough in here for us to believe that. And in terms of how tactics flow, Boaz leads with the estate in mind. It's almost like he knows that what this guy wants was the estate and the incentive of the inheritance. Okay, that's pretty clear from the way that he precipitates this entire discussion, right? Talking about Naomi, talking about the brother Elimelech, talking about his obligations and his claim to the inheritance, right? He leads with that very clearly in his first speech, and then allowing this mystery man, this mystery redeemer, to respond before he then drops the bombshell in verse 5. Now, I don't think all that is accidental, but neither do I think that it is devious or cunning in the negative sense of the word. Because we got to remember, back at our threshing room floor, Boaz was motivated with kindness. He was motivated with redemptive love for Ruth. And that's actually the main thing from Boaz's point of view. Now, from the narration point of view of the story, there's actually more that's going on. But from Boaz's own heart and character, it seems that Ruth was the one that was on his mind, not simply because of love, but also for redemption as well. So could Boaz have done it any other way? Perhaps he could. The hypotheticals you can always entertain again and again and for ages, but I think what we have here is just a very remarkable, very courageous piece of public legal showmanship that actually is fired up by his heart for Ruth. I hope that answers the question there. All right, moving on. Now, this is the second question. If the first Redeemer didn't want to risk his own estate by acquiring Ruth's land and then marrying Ruth, then what did Boaz risk, or what did Boaz sacrifice? Did Boaz also have a family line like the first in line Redeemer? Is that one of the points of learning in this chapter? That is, Boaz stepped forward to look after Ruth and Naomi. That certainly is the point, but I'll get back to that a bit later. First of all, it's not really clear when the Redeemer says, I can't possibly take this deal. It's going to ruin my inheritance. It's not really clear. It's not really explained for us how this inheritance would exactly be ruined of his. I tell you what, this guy, in taking on Ruth, he possibly had four options. The first would be to take the land, claim Ruth as his wife, and to fulfill his duties as a redeemer and to care for Ruth and Naomi. That's option number one. The second option would be to take the land and take Ruth, but then later on renege on the deal, and so cuts Ruth out of the picture. But that wasn't going to be good for his standing in the community. But that was another option. Number three was to take the land, right, and ask Boaz to marry Ruth, right? He could have done that. But that would actually run into its own problems, because remember, Ruth was the daughter-in-law of Naomi. If she then had a son with Boaz, that child would actually have the claim to the land that was claimed by this redeemer, and therefore that wasn't going to be that great for him either. Or the fourth option was for him to just walk away from the deal entirely, right? And that is saying something, because by putting out the economic reasons, this inheritance reasons, there's actually every reason to suspect that he may have been masking other motivations as well. He may not have wanted to take Ruth because Ruth was a Moabite. That could be a very good reason, which is also quite likely. And so him walking away from the deal, clearly he felt that there was something that he had to risk through it. But Boaz didn't have that problem. Boaz knew Ruth. Boaz knew that Ruth was a woman of great and noble character. Boaz didn't care that Ruth was a Moabite, right? And Boaz, more importantly, treasured this importance of carrying Ruth's line and also Naomi's line as well. And so the contrast there is pretty clear. We don't know what Boaz would have had to sacrifice, but I'm guessing if he was a non-family man, he would have had to also sacrifice his own energies, his own love, his own support, right? Anytime you take on two widows into your family, that itself was going to be a sacrifice. But clearly there was more at play. There's probably more murky stuff going on with this family redeemer who ends up walking away from the deal. And at the end of the day, this really highlights for us Boaz's integrity. It highlights Boaz's actions. Now notice that this is actually now the chapter 4, where Boaz actually steps up to the light and steps up to the plate and actually does something active and loving. In chapter 2, It was Ruth. In chapter 3, it was Naomi and Ruth. But in chapter 4, it was Boaz's turn to step up to the plate. That, I think, has got to be the lesson that we learn here. And therefore, it's something that we got to consider now as Christians, about being courageous and stepping out in faith, knowing the duty of love and care that we have for the vulnerable as well. I hope that answers that question. Okay, and one more, and we'll finish with this. If Boaz was meant to redeem Ruth to preserve the line for Elimelech, then why is it that only Boaz's name that is mentioned in the genealogy? Elimelech's name is not mentioned at all. Now, that's a sharp observation, and it's one that got me thinking as well, because by the end of Ruth, we do see a genealogy. We see Boaz's name, Boaz's parents, and his sons' names, but we don't see the name of Elimelech. But then we have to think about something. Genealogy was a way that the line was of the family name to be perpetuated. However, that's not the only way that a line is perpetuated as well. We got to remember that that the allotment of the land was given to God's people originally because it's God's land overall, and it was meant to be a way where God's people were to be allocated to God's land, and therefore every subsequent generation always held titles and rights and deeds that could be called an inheritance that's passed on from family to family. Now, when the man of a family dies, and the wife cannot sell property, by the way, if the man dies, that land could be lost, possibly forever and for good. And part of God's law and custom at the time, you'll find it in Leviticus 25, in Deuteronomy 25, was that there was an opportunity for redemption, that this deceased man's widow could remarry, and that the child that's born into that union would actually take on the title deed of that family and live on, and to perpetuate the estate that's held in the name of the deceased man. That is, the property name will continue forward, bearing this child's name, bearing the name of the father who had died, so that the land just keeps going on and on. Okay, that's actually what God's design originally was, which is why you cannot sell the land to others, which is why it's a terrible thing to be widowed, you see. So when it says there that a family is born to Elimelech, or that a son is born to Naomi, right? What this is getting across is that Elimelech's property will continue on. That's what Boaz ensured. Boaz ensured that by marrying Ruth and bearing a son in that marriage, that son, who was the son of Ruth's dead husband, and therefore Naomi's son, that son will actually carry on the property and title deeds of Naomi's family line. Naomi's inheritance and property would not go to waste. Naomi's property would instead forward on. And I think that's what's meant when the line for Elimelech is preserved. And this, is helping us understand that the preservation of the family line isn't just in terms of the name that's passed on in terms of sons, but about the property that's packaged with it as well. And it kind of speaks to us about how Elimelech was concerned, not just for Ruth's well-being, but for Ruth to have an estate with Naomi's family line that would continue down through the ages. Boaz, as a landowner himself, would have known how important this was. And so I hope that you see that Naomi also found redemption, not in a son, but not just in a son, but in a son that will carry the property name down her line for ages and ages. They are all part of the clan. They are still all part of God's people. Naomi is not a nobody anymore in the history books of Israel's land register. I hope that makes sense, and I think that's probably what's meant there. Well, I hope that answers some of your questions. I hope that you have seen through all this how Boaz's integrity and loyalty is one that matches Ruth's nobleness of character. And I hope that you see that even through a story where God's name is entirely not mentioned at all, you can see the power of God's redemptive work and redemptive hand through the details of the story in order to bring fullness in order to bring and to preserve the integrity of the land in a way that would lead to his ultimate purpose being fulfilled through King David and ultimately through Jesus Christ himself. Well, that's it for me. I hope you guys are all traveling well, keeping safe. I will see you guys on Sunday. Bye for now.